The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 47th floor penthouse, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors of Manhattan's sanctuary. Outside, the city sprawled beneath him like a conquered kingdom, millions of people going about their insignificant lives, entirely unaware that their financial destinies could be altered by a single decision from the man who stood silently overlooking them all. Was tall, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, with salt and pepper hair styled to absolute perfection. His steel-gray eyes reflected a lifetime of calculated decisions, aggressive negotiations, and unwavering dominance in every sphere he'd entered. At 58 years old, he was worth $3.2 billion, a number he'd grown accustomed to mentioning casually at social gatherings where other billionaires congregated. But this morning was furious. The source of his fury was Titan, a 110-pound German shepherd currently destroying a custom Italian leather sofa that had cost $47,000. The dog's muscular frame rippled with barely contained aggression as he tore through the cushions with teeth that seemed designed by nature specifically to inflict maximum damage. Shredded fabric flew through the air like confetti at a celebration neither of them were enjoying. Titan's eyes were wild, untamed, filled with a primal rage that seemed to burn from somewhere deep within his core. His snarls echoed through the cavernous penthouse, a sound so feral and uncontrolled that it sent shivers down the spines of anyone unfortunate enough to witness it. Had acquired Titan 3 months ago from an exclusive Russian breeder who specialized in championship bloodlines. The dog came with pedigree papers dating back 5 generations, certificates of achievement in international dog shows, and a price tag of $500,000, a sum that barely registered as an expense in his vast financial portfolio. The breeder had assured him that Titan represented the pinnacle of canine excellence, intelligent, powerful, and perfectly bred for dominance. He was supposed to be a symbol of status, a living testament to his ability to possess the rarest, most elite specimens of anything worth owning. Instead, he'd become a nightmare. The first week with Titan had been deceptively peaceful. The dog seemed well-mannered, almost docile, but subtle cracks had begun appearing almost immediately. Titan would suddenly snap at handlers. He'd refuse commands from trainers. His aggression seemed to escalate without warning or apparent cause. Within 2 weeks, he'd bitten 3 different staff members, not viciously enough to cause serious injury, but enough to terrify anyone who worked in the penthouse. Accustomed to solving every problem by throwing money at it, hired the best professional dog trainer money could buy. That had been a mistake. The first trainer, a celebrity behaviorist named Richard who charged $50,000 per week, lasted exactly 6 days. He arrived with confidence radiating from every pore, equipped with state-of-the-art training equipment and a philosophy based on dominance hierarchy. Watched from his office as attempted to establish himself as the alpha. Titan, apparently disagreeing with this assessment, had launched himself at with such ferocity that the trainer barely escaped with his dignity intact. Quit that evening, claiming he'd never encountered a dog with such profound psychological trauma and dangerous aggression. He refused to return, despite offering to double his fee. The second trainer came from California, a woman named Hines who'd appeared on multiple reality television shows about dog rehabilitation. She arrived with a camera crew in tow, ready to document her inevitable triumph. She lasted 3 days. Titan had cornered her in the penthouse kitchen, and though he hadn't actually attacked her, his body language had been so threatening that had locked herself in the pantry and called 911. She left Manhattan on the first available flight, and had to sign non-disclosure agreements preventing her from discussing the incident with her production company. Trainers 3, 4, and 5 followed in rapid succession, each departing with increasingly creative excuses. One claimed his previous injury had been aggravated. Another suggested that Titan might be spiritually disturbed and recommended an animal exorcist, a suggestion that had sent into an apoplectic rage. The fifth trainer simply left a letter stating that no amount of money was worth his life. Now, standing in his penthouse and watching Titan destroy his furniture with methodical precision, felt something he rarely experienced: a loss of control. This dog, purchased to represent his mastery over every aspect of his existence, had become a symbol of his impotence, and did not accept impotence in any form. He watched as Titan paused in his destruction, breathing heavily, his massive chest heaving with exertion. The dog's eyes locked onto with unmistakable intelligence. It wasn't the mindless gaze of an animal, but something more challenging, something almost contemptuous. In that moment, made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives, though he couldn't possibly know it yet. The following morning called an emergency board meeting. The conference room on the 46th floor filled with executives, advisors, and financial consultants, the most powerful people in his technological empire, all summoned to witness what their CEO was about to announce. They sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure why they'd been called. Enjoyed making people wait. It amplified his power. He stood at the head of the massive glass table, hands clasped behind his back, radiating absolute certainty. "I've encountered an interesting problem," he announced, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "My dog Titan has proven unable to be trained by conventional methods, so I'm issuing a public challenge." He paused, letting the drama build. $1 million to anyone who can calm Titan within 30 days. Any trainer, any method, any approach. $1 million, paid in full to whoever succeeds. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. His CFO immediately started calculating the financial implications. His PR director began mentally drafting press releases, but silenced them all with a single raised hand. "I don't expect anyone to succeed," he continued, a thin smile crossing his face. "This is impossible. I'm essentially giving myself free publicity while proving that some things, some creatures, some problems, cannot be solved with conventional wisdom." He believed he'd engineered the perfect situation. He'd established himself as a man confident enough to risk $1 million on the impossible. The publicity would be invaluable. And of course, he wouldn't have to pay anything because failure was inevitable. Had no idea that somewhere in the city, a small homeless girl was about to change everything. He had no idea that his perfect game was already being dismantled by forces he couldn't control or predict. He had no idea that the greatest lesson of his life was about to be delivered by the most unlikely teacher imaginable. All he knew in that moment was that he'd constructed an unwinnable scenario. He was certain of it. He was completely, absolutely wrong. The news broke on a Tuesday morning like a digital explosion across every platform imaginable. Within hours of its announcement, the story had been picked up by major news networks, trending on social media with hashtags like $1 million dog bet and Titan challenge. Morning talk show hosts debated the possibility endlessly. Radio stations interviewed dog experts. YouTube videos speculating on methods proliferated like digital rabbits. The story had captured the collective imagination of America: a billionaire, an impossible dog, a fortune waiting to be claimed. There was something almost mythological about it, a modern-day fairy tale with the promise of transformation through skill and determination. By Wednesday afternoon, the first trainer arrived. His name was Robert "Bobby" Martinez, a 34-year-old dog trainer from Miami who'd spent the last 15 years perfecting his craft. Bobby had built a modest but successful business training aggressive dogs, and he genuinely believed his method was revolutionary. He'd seen the news while eating lunch at his favorite Cuban restaurant and had immediately purchased a plane ticket to New York. His wife thought he was insane. His business partner urged him to reconsider. But Bobby was a believer in fate, in destiny, in the idea that opportunities didn't knock twice. If $1 million was waiting in Manhattan, then Miami could wait. He arrived at its building with a simple canvas bag, containing a few training implements and boundless optimism. By Thursday morning, He was back on a plane to Miami, shaken but determined to forget the entire experience. What Bobby didn't realize was that he was about to be the first of an avalanche. By Friday, 7 trainers had arrived in Manhattan. By the following Monday, that number had grown to 18. By the end of the second week, there were nearly 50. They came from California, Texas, Florida, Colorado, and a dozen other states. They came with different philosophies, different methodologies, different levels of confidence and experience. They arrived like pilgrims journeying to a holy site, each believing they possessed the secret formula that would unlock Titan's cooperation. Dr. Sandra arrived from Los Angeles with a film crew documenting her every move. She'd built her reputation on television shows where she rehabilitated aggressive dogs through positive reinforcement and gentle encouragement. Her Instagram following exceeded 2 million people. She had a book deal pending. She had sponsorship agreements with premium dog food companies. She had every reason to believe that her particular brand of animal psychology would work. She arrived at its penthouse with confidence radiating from her perfectly highlighted hair to her custom designer training boots. She lasted exactly 48 hours. What Sandra hadn't anticipated was that Titan seemed to view her methods with contempt. When she attempted to reward him with high-value treats for calm behavior, he ignored the treats and instead focused his aggression on her. When she tried to create safe spaces and positive associations, Titan somehow sensed the artificiality of it all and responded with increasing hostility. The moment she attempted to place a training collar around his neck, the dog lunged with such ferocity that Sandra's camera operator barely managed to scramble out of the way. Sandra left the penthouse looking shell-shocked, her perfectly applied makeup streaked with perspiration and what might have been tears. "That dog is evil," she announced to the waiting media outside's building. "Legitimately evil. I've worked with thousands of aggressive dogs, and I've never encountered anything like that creature." Her departure only increased the media frenzy. Colonel James arrived from Fort Benning, Georgia, a retired military K-9 handler with 32 years of experience training dogs for combat and protection services. His credentials were impeccable. His dogs had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and numerous other theaters of conflict. They'd been trained to respond instantly to commands, to maintain discipline under the most extreme circumstances, and to execute their duties with mechanical precision. If anyone could establish dominance over Titan, surely it would be a man who trained dogs to engage in actual warfare. Colonel approached the challenge with military precision. He arrived with a detailed training regimen, specific protocols, and unwavering confidence in his methodology. He'd commanded thousands of soldiers. Surely he could command one dog. He established what he called the hierarchy of authority, implementing strict dominance-based training techniques that had worked flawlessly in military contexts for decades. Titan's response was swift and unambiguous, complete refusal and escalating aggression. On the third day of their interaction, Titan attacked with such sudden violence that the colonel required emergency room treatment for a deep laceration on his right arm. He left the penthouse wrapped in bandages and considerably less confident, muttering about how some creatures are simply beyond redemption. Doctor, a renowned animal psychologist from university, approached the challenge with rigorous scientific methodology. She arrived with research papers, behavioral analysis frameworks, and a team of graduate students equipped with cameras and recording equipment. She believed Titan's aggression stemmed from psychological trauma, that his behavior was ultimately a cry for help disguised as violence. She designed experiments to test various hypotheses. She created stimuli to observe his responses. She attempted to trace the roots of his aggression through careful observation and controlled interactions. Her approach was intellectually rigorous and theoretically sound. It failed spectacularly. Titan seemed almost deliberately antagonistic toward her scientific methods, as if he could sense the clinical distance in her observations and was determined to express his fury about it. When she attempted to measure his stress responses using various stimuli, he destroyed her equipment with targeted precision, as if to make a point about the futility of quantifying his emotions. By the third week, the parade of trainers had become almost comical. There was a dog whisperer from Colorado who claimed to communicate with animals through energy alignment. He lasted 2 hours before Titan backed him into a corner. There was a trainer from Texas who specialized in understanding the alpha mentality through dance and meditation. Titan's response was to ignore him entirely, which somehow felt more insulting than outright aggression. There was even a self-proclaimed dog psychic from California who attempted to read Titan's aura and communicate with his past life memories. She left after Titan growled at her for 6 continuous minutes without stopping. Watched from his 47th floor office with barely concealed amusement. Each failure was validation of his genius. Each trainer's departure was another piece of evidence proving that he'd constructed something truly impossible. The media coverage was extraordinary. News outlets competed to document the latest trainer's failure. Late-night comedians made jokes about the challenge. Betting pools emerged online, with odds heavily favoring that no one would succeed. Some people were betting that Titan was literally supernatural, that the dog was possessed by some malevolent force. Encouraged these narratives, they only increased his mystique, his status, his absolute certainty that he'd created an unwinnable game. By day 25, 24 trainers had attempted and failed. The media frenzy had reached fever pitch. Television networks were discussing doing live coverage of the final week's attempts. Sports commentators were analyzing it like a major sporting event. The challenge had transcended the realm of dog training and entered the realm of cultural phenomenon. And in none of this chaos, none of this attention, none of this focus on solutions and methodologies and expert techniques, did anyone consider that the answer might come from the most unexpected place imaginable. No one considered that salvation might arrive in the form of a 7-year-old girl with nothing to her name except kindness and a desperate need for connection. The city continued its oblivious movement forward, entirely unaware that destiny was about to enter from the shadows, 3 miles away from its gleaming penthouse, in a neighborhood where the buildings grew progressively older and more weathered, where the streets smelled of exhaust and desperation, where hope seemed to be a luxury item that had long ago been marked down and eventually clearance-priced out of existence. There was an alley behind a grocery store called Market. The alley was narrow, cramped, lined with dumpsters that overflowed with discarded dreams along with discarded packaging materials. Rats skittered across broken concrete. The walls were tagged with graffiti in 3 different languages, each tag representing someone's need to prove they existed, that they'd left some mark on the world, however temporary and unwelcome. In the deepest corner of this alley, beneath a rusted fire escape, and partially obscured by a collection of cardboard boxes that had been flattened and restacked with surprising precision, 7-year-old Maya sat huddled against the cold November air. She was a small child, even for her age, with dark hair matted from days without proper washing and brown eyes that seemed to contain a wisdom far beyond her years. Her clothing was several sizes too large, hand-me-downs and thrift store, finds that her mother had managed to acquire through the various shelters and charitable organizations that had become the landscape of their existence. Maya had been homeless for 8 months. The story of how a 7-year-old girl ended up sleeping in alleys was the story of America's hidden crisis, told in miniature through the lens of one family's catastrophic collapse. Her mother had worked as a medical transcriptionist until her employer's business went bankrupt. Her father had abandoned them years ago, leaving behind nothing but debt and trauma. When her mother had broken her leg in a car accident, the cascade of medical expenses had been catastrophic. Hospital bills, physical therapy, medications. The costs had spiraled exponentially, each bill more impossible than the last. They'd lost their apartment in their neighborhood, then another cheaper apartment, then another. Eventually, they'd lost the concept of apartment entirely. For the past 8 months, home had been a rotating collection of shelters, church basements, and street corners. Home had been whatever cardboard boxes they could find, and however Maya's mother could construct them into something resembling protection from the elements. Home had been hunger, persistent and gnawing, and never fully satisfied even when they managed to find food. Home had been the complicated feeling of being unseen by most people while simultaneously being to those predators and criminals who preyed on the vulnerable. But Maya had discovered something during these 8 months of hardship. She discovered that she possessed an unusual gift, an almost supernatural ability to sense pain in others, to recognize trauma and loneliness when she encountered them, and to respond with a gentleness that seemed impossible given her circumstances. The shelter workers had noticed it. When other children fought over toys, Maya shared hers. When other residents raged against their situations, Maya offered quiet companionship. She couldn't fix anything, couldn't solve anyone's problems, but somehow her presence seemed to make things slightly more bearable. Animals, she discovered, responded to this gift even more profoundly than people did. She'd befriended a 3-legged cat that lived behind another building. She'd nursed an injured pigeon back to health with breadcrumbs she'd carefully saved from her own limited rations. A middle-aged dog that belonged to someone living in a shelter had followed her around for 3 days before his owner claimed him, and Maya had cried that night, real, genuine tears of loss that seemed disproportionate to the attachment she'd formed, except that she understood something about that dog that most people wouldn't have. She understood his loneliness, his displacement, his confusion about why his human situation had suddenly become so unstable. On that particular freezing November evening, November 15th, to be precise, though Maya didn't keep track of such things, she'd ventured out from her usual sleeping spot searching for food. The grocery store's dumpster-behinds market had proven fruitful in the past. Sometimes they threw out perfectly good produce with only minor bruises. Sometimes there were bread items a day past their sell-by date but perfectly edible. Sometimes there were even sealed packaged goods that had been damaged in shipping. That's when she heard it. The sound cut through the urban noise like a knife through butter, a bark so desperate, so terrified, so completely filled with anguish that Maya's entire body responded to it involuntarily. She knew that sound. She'd heard variations of it in her own voice during the darkest moments of her homelessness. It was the sound of a creature experiencing genuine fear and confusion, the sound of someone, something, that had lost its way and couldn't understand how to find home again. She followed the sound deeper into the alley, navigating past broken glass and refuse with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to move carefully through dangerous spaces. What she found was a magnificent creature, a massive German shepherd with a coat that shone like polished mahogany even in the dim light filtering through the alley. The dog was absolutely enormous, at least 10 times Maya's weight, with muscles that rippled beneath his fur and teeth that looked capable of inflicting serious damage. Titan was terrified. The dog had escaped during a training session that afternoon when a handler had briefly stepped away to take a phone call, leaving the penthouse door open for just long enough. He'd bolted, panic overriding any training, his massive form moving through the city streets with desperate confusion. He'd never been outside unsupervised. He'd never had to navigate the chaos of urban life. His expensive breeding, his championship bloodline, his $500,000 price tag, none of it had prepared him for the terror of being lost. He'd eventually ended up in this alley, cornering himself, his breathing rapid and panicked, his eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. Maya did not run. She did not scream. She did not attempt to grab the dog or approach him with the aggressive confidence that most people would have displayed when encountering a large, potentially dangerous animal. Instead, she sat down. She lowered herself to the cold concrete, right there in the filthy alley, and simply existed near the dog without any expectation of response. Her movements were slow and deliberate. Her body language was non-threatening. Her entire presence communicated a single message: I am not a threat. I am simply here with you in this moment of fear. Hey, she whispered, her voice barely audible, fragile as tissue paper. It's okay. I know you're scared. I'm scared too, pretty much all the time, actually. She spoke as if talking to herself, not really addressing the dog, which somehow made it more powerful. My name's Maya. I don't have much. No house, no real family situation, not even a reliable place to sleep. But I'm here, and I get it. Whatever's happened to you, whatever made you so angry and scared and confused, I get it. Titan's breathing began to slow. You know what's funny? Maya continued, still staring at the wall rather than at the dog. You look like you're supposed to be important, like you're supposed to have everything figured out. But look at us. We're both just lost creatures trying to make sense of why nothing makes sense anymore. She pulled 2 slightly damaged granola bars from her pocket. She'd been saving them. I was going to eat these tomorrow, but I think you need them more than I do right now. She placed the granola bars on the ground between them and sat perfectly still. For the first time since his escape, Titan's aggressive posture began to soften. Something about this small, broken human who smelled like desperation and kindness seemed to reach into the darkest part of him and offer recognition. Not judgment, not attempted control, just understanding. The massive dog, the one that had defeated trainer after trainer, the one that seemed almost deliberately antagonistic toward human authority, slowly began to inch toward the small girl in the alley. The next morning dawned gray and cold over Manhattan, the kind of November morning that made people pull their coats and walk faster, hurrying through the discomfort toward whatever destination promised warmth and shelter. But the morning arrived with an unexpected complication that disrupted his carefully orchestrated world. Titan was gone. The penthouse's security system, sophisticated enough to detect a mouse entering through a crack, had somehow failed to register the dog's disappearance. The staff was in chaos. The head of security was panicking about potential liability. Animal control had been contacted. The news was already beginning to circulate through media channels. The billionaire's impossible dog had escaped the impossible challenge. The symbolism was too delicious for journalists to resist. Stood in his office, looking at security footage that showed absolutely nothing useful, when his assistant buzzed through with an update. Mister, we've received a report. Someone brought Titan back to the building. Brought him back. His mind raced through possibilities. Who, how? The doorman couldn't get details. He says a child was involved, but when the dog arrived, the child disappeared into the crowd. The doorman recognized Titan from the news coverage. He's currently with our security team in the lower holding area. Felt something shift in his chest, not quite concern, but something adjacent to it. He descended to the lower levels of his building where Titan was secured, expecting to find the chaotic, aggressive dog he'd come to know. What he found instead was something that made his carefully constructed worldview stumble slightly. Titan was calm. Not just calm, serene. The dog's posture was relaxed. His breathing was steady and measured. The wild, aggressive energy that had defined his entire personality seemed to have been replaced by something altogether different. The dog's eyes, usually filled with barely contained fury, now reflected something almost contemplative. What happened? Demanded of the security team. We're not entirely sure, sir. The doorman says that when Titan arrived, he was with a small child, a girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, homeless apparently. The child guided Titan right into the building, calm as you please. When the doorman approached, she just disappeared into the foot traffic. We checked the security footage, but she blended into the crowd and we lost her. Stared at Titan, watching the dog with the intensity he usually reserved for analyzing financial reports. Something fundamental had shifted in the animal's demeanor. The transformation was undeniable, almost miraculous. But was a man who didn't believe in miracles. He believed in cause and effect, in logical chains of causality, in the scientific principles that governed outcomes. There had to be a rational explanation. He arranged for Titan to meet with the next trainer scheduled for that day, a woman named who specialized in rescue dog rehabilitation. Arrived full of renewed hope, armed with research studies and case files demonstrating her success rate with difficult animals. She'd watched the news about Titan's escape and return, and believed she might finally have a breakthrough in sight. Perhaps the dog simply needed to experience freedom to reset his psychological patterns. She worked with Titan for 6 hours. The results were promising but ultimately temporary. Yes, Titan was calmer than he'd been with other trainers. Yes, he responded better to commands. Yes, he seemed more cooperative and less aggressively antagonistic. But by evening, the calm had begun to crack. His aggression started creeping back in at the edges. The temporary transformation was fading like a sunset, beautiful but ultimately fleeting. "It's fascinating," told that evening in his office. "Something clearly happened to shift his psychological state, but the effects are not permanent. Whatever caused the initial change has worn off. It's like a psychological anesthetic, effective in the moment but without lasting impact." Felt frustration building behind his eyes. He'd been so certain for just a few hours that the impossible had been solved. Now he was back to square one, with only 15 days remaining before his 30-day deadline. He found himself obsessing over the mysterious child. Security footage from all the cameras in the lobby area was reviewed frame by frame. There, a small figure in oversized clothing, walking beside Titan as if escorting royalty to a destination he was genuinely interested in attending. The child's face was partially obscured by stringy dark hair and a hood pulled low, but her body language conveyed absolute certainty. She wasn't dragging the dog. She wasn't coercing him. She was simply walking beside him as if they'd known each other for years, as if this was a perfectly normal morning activity for both of them. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had she found Titan? And most importantly, what had she done that had caused such a dramatic shift in the dog's behavior? His curiosity was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, not about profit or advantage. It was genuine, authentic curiosity about a mystery he couldn't immediately solve. He attempted to track her down through various channels. He contacted the police to see if they had any record of a homeless child matching her description. He worked with the news media, asking for help in identifying the mysterious girl. He offered rewards. He created social media campaigns. But the girl had disappeared as completely as she'd arrived, dissolving into the city's vast population as if she'd been nothing more than a phantom. Days passed. The trainers continued to arrive and fail. The media continued to speculate. The countdown continued toward the deadline, but found his mind returning again and again to that mysterious child and the inexplicable transformation she'd caused. He began to wonder if she might return. On the morning of day 23, something shifted in Titan's behavior again. The dog became agitated, restless, packing the penthouse like he was searching for something. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't cooperate with the current trainer. He simply moved back and forth, his eyes tracking toward the windows, toward the streets below, toward some invisible point in the distance. It was as if he was waiting for someone. Watched this behavior with growing understanding. The dog wasn't broken because of trauma or aggression or psychological damage. The dog was lonely. He was missing something, or rather, someone, that had awakened something in him that all the professional training and expensive methods had failed to touch. The girl had given Titan something that money couldn't buy, genuine connection. And now the dog was mourning her absence. Stood at his window on the 47th floor, looking out across the vast city below at the millions of people navigating their individual lives, and he felt something entirely unexpected: empathy. Not for himself, not for his impossible bet, but for the massive dog packing his penthouse, missing a homeless girl he'd only known for a few hours. What was that girl doing right now? Where was she sleeping? Was she cold? Was she hungry? Was she thinking about the dog the way the dog was clearly thinking about her? A man who'd built his empire by maintaining emotional distance and calculated indifference found himself unexpectedly troubled by questions he'd never bothered to consider before. The girl was out there somewhere in the city, and somehow, inexplicably, she becomes central to everything. December arrived in Manhattan with a brutality that only a New York winter could deliver. The temperature dropped precipitously, plummeting into the single digits by mid-month. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, accumulating on the streets and buildings, transforming the city into a landscape of crystalline beauty and lethal cold. For those who had homes with heating systems, December was manageable. For those without, December was a battle for survival. Maya understood this battle intimately. The shelter system was overwhelmed as the temperatures plummeted. Beds filled up quickly each evening, and those who arrived too late were turned away to face the streets. She and her mother had developed a rotation system. Some nights they'd secure shelter beds. Other nights they'd huddle together in abandoned buildings or beneath highway overpasses, using cardboard and layers of newspaper as insulation against the merciless cold. Her mother had developed a cough that wouldn't go away, a persistent hacking sound that terrified Maya even though she didn't fully understand why. But Maya thought about Titan constantly. She'd seen him on the news, the billionaire's impossible dog, the center of the media circus. She'd watched footage of trainers attempting and failing. She'd seen the footage of herself bringing him into the building, though her face had been obscured by her hood and hair. She'd recognized something in his eyes that afternoon in the alley, something that mirrored her own experience. She'd seen a creature displaced and confused, searching for home, terrified of his circumstances. And somehow, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, she'd understood him. But more than that, she wondered if he understood her. On the morning of December 19th, with 5 days remaining before its deadline, Maya made a decision that her rational mind knew was terrible. She was sick. Not terminally, but with a cold that had settled into her chest and wouldn't leave. Her mother had insisted she stay in the shelter that night, using the one available bed while worked a night shift at a cleaning company that paid cash under the table. Maya's fever had finally broken that morning, leaving her weak but determined. She had to find Titan. She had to know if he was okay. She had to know if he remembered her. She had to know if somehow, impossibly, they'd made a real connection or if it had been nothing more than temporary circumstance and coincidence. She was 7 years old and homeless and sick, but in that moment, the only thing that mattered was finding that dog. The journey to his building took her across the width of Manhattan, through snow that reached her ankles, past shops with glittering displays that seemed to mock her poverty, past other homeless people huddled in doorways trying to survive the cold. She walked, her thin jacket providing almost no protection against the elements, her shoes worn through at the heel, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. By the time she reached the gleaming glass tower on Fifth Avenue, her fingers were numb and her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Security guards in warm, comfortable uniforms stood outside the building's entrance, professional and imposing. Maya approached them anyway, her small frame absolutely dwarfed by the massive entrance and the grown adults guarding it. "I need to see Titan," she announced, her voice barely audible beneath the traffic sounds and wind. The guards exchanged glances. This was a homeless child, clearly suffering from exposure, attempting to access one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings. Protocol dictated immediate removal from the premises. "I'm sorry, kid, but you can't come in here," one of the guards said, not unkindly. "This is private property. You need to leave." "Titan's here," Maya insisted, not comprehending that trespassing laws and property rights existed in her world. "He's sad. He needs me." "You need to go," the second guard said more firmly, moving toward her with the intention of physically escorting her away. "We'll call someone if you need help." But then something extraordinary happened. A commotion erupted inside the building's lobby. The sound of excited barking echoed through the glass doors. Titan, being walked by security coordinator, had caught the scent that had been imprinted in his memory from that afternoon in the alley. The massive dog pulled against his leash with sudden, desperate force, barking frantically, his entire body straining toward the entrance. The guards froze, recognizing the dog immediately from the news coverage. And in that moment of hesitation, Titan's handler attempted to control the animal, but the dog's pull was too powerful, his need too urgent. With what seemed like supernatural strength, Titan lunged forward, pulling his leash taut but not breaking it, pressing against the glass doors. His eyes locked on Maya's eyes. In that instant of mutual recognition, something transcended the barriers between them, the glass, the class differences, the impossible circumstances. Titan's entire body transformed. His aggressive barking transformed into something almost like joy. His desperate pulling transformed into something resembling eagerness rather than aggression. Who had been in his office reviewing financial reports, heard the commotion and descended to the lobby to investigate. What he witnessed was the second impossible thing related to this child. The world's most aggressive, uncontrollable dog was absolutely frantic to reach a small homeless girl standing outside his building in December weather that could kill. "What's happening?" demanded, approaching rapidly. "That dog is completely losing it," the security coordinator gasped, struggling to maintain control of Titan. "He's never acted like this and I can't keep him." "The child," interrupted, looking at the small figure outside the glass doors. Her face was pale, her lips almost blue, her body visibly trembling from cold. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. She was wearing clothing that was literally falling apart from wear. Her shoes were practically destroyed. She looked like the embodiment of poverty and hardship. She was also the only thing in the world that Titan wanted. Made a split-second decision that completely contradicted his usual protocols. He moved toward the doors and opened them himself. The December cold rushed in like a physical entity. The wind cut through the lobby with surprising ferocity. But Titan immediately pressed against Maya, his massive body providing warmth and weight and presence. The girl wrapped her small arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur, and for the first time in days, maybe for the first time since they'd separated, Titan was completely calm. "Bring her inside," commanded, shocking everyone present including himself. "Now." The guards hesitated, uncertain of this directive that directly contradicted every security protocol they'd been trained to follow. But its authority was absolute. Within seconds, they gently guided Maya and Titan inside, away from the lethal cold. "What's your name?" asked the girl, who looked up at him with eyes that seemed impossibly old for her age. "Maya," she whispered, her voice raspy from cold and her recent illness. "I needed to see if Titan was okay. I needed to know if he was sad." Felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd constructed over decades of emotional self-protection. This child, homeless and freezing and sick, had walked across the winter city not for money, not for reward, not for any logical reason. She'd come because she was worried about a dog. She'd come because connection mattered to her more than her own survival. "Come with me," said quietly. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't making a calculation about advantage or benefit. He was simply responding to a human need that transcended all his carefully constructed rules about wealth and property and appropriate boundaries. Maya followed, her hand on Titan's neck, the dog moving beside her like he never intended to be separated again. Penthouse had never accommodated a homeless child before. The space was designed for a single man with meticulous tastes and an obsession with minimalist aesthetics. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. Everything was expensive and carefully curated. The sudden arrival of a 7-year-old girl in his sanctuary created a collision between worlds that felt almost violent in its incongruity. He instructed his staff to prepare a room for her, not one of the guest suites in the penthouse itself, but rather a modest hotel room at a nearby boutique hotel that he owned. He arranged for meals to be delivered. He hired a doctor to examine her, treating her cold and ensuring she had proper medication. He made phone calls to the shelter system, locating her mother and arranging for her to be brought to the same hotel, provided with a separate room. To the outside world and to himself, framed this as a calculated business decision. The girl clearly had some inexplicable connection to Titan. If he provided her with comfort and security for the next 2 weeks, the remaining time before his deadline, perhaps she could work with the dog more effectively. Perhaps her presence would permanently shift the dog's behavior in ways that all the professional trainers had failed to accomplish. Perhaps this was simply another problem to be solved through resource allocation and strategic thinking, but was beginning to recognize that his own rationalizations were becoming increasingly transparent, even to himself. Maya arrived at the hotel with her mother on the evening of December 19th, both of them shell-shocked by the sudden transformation of their circumstances. Had been working a night shift when she received a phone call from her daughter's location. She'd been terrified at first, certain something terrible had happened. Instead, she discovered that her daughter had somehow secured not just shelter but genuine comfort. A warm room, hot food, a bed with clean sheets. Looked at with an expression that combined profound gratitude and deep wariness. She'd learned through hard experience not to trust sudden generosity. People didn't simply help homeless people without expecting something in return. There was always a transaction, always a hidden cost. "What do you want from her?" asked directly, her Korean accent thickening slightly as her stress elevated. Was momentarily taken aback by the directness of the question. No one questioned him so bluntly anymore. His wealth and status had trained most people to accept his actions without scrutiny. "I want her to spend time with my dog," he said honestly. "During the day while you're here resting and recovering, that's all." Studied him carefully, searching for deception. What she found instead seemed to be genuine, if complicated, motivation. And afterward, what happens to us after 2 weeks? Realized he hadn't thought past the immediate problem. His world didn't typically extend beyond the next quarterly earnings report or the next business challenge. Long-term human planning for people outside his immediate circle wasn't something he practiced. "We'll discuss it," he said finally. "Let's see how the next 2 weeks develop." The arrangement began the following morning. Maya was brought to penthouse early each day, Titan greeting her with such undisguised joy that even couldn't pretend it was merely behavioral adjustment. The dog didn't need training from Maya. He needed her presence. He needed her companionship. He needed the specific form of acceptance and understanding that she offered. Over those 14 days, something remarkable unfolded. Maya didn't approach Titan with any agenda of fixing him. She didn't use treats as incentives or commands as control mechanisms. She simply existed with him. She sat in his presence for hours, talking about her life, her fears, her dreams. She spoke about her mother's illness and her worry that they'd have to return to the streets. She spoke about the fear of cold, the shame of being homeless, the complicated feelings she had about her absent father. She spoke about small kindnesses people had shown her, and about the cruelty she'd experienced. And Titan listened. The dog would rest his massive head on her lap. He would breathe synchronously with her breathing. He would maintain eye contact with an intensity that suggested he genuinely understood the emotional content of what she was communicating. When she cried, which happened several times as the weight of her circumstances occasionally overwhelmed her, Titan would press closer, offering his body as comfort. Observed all of this from a distance, watching from his office doorway or through security cameras, and something in his carefully ordered worldview began to destabilize. He'd spent his entire life accumulating wealth because he believed wealth was the ultimate currency of control and security. Money could buy anything: education, status, comfort, even other people's loyalty if you were willing to pay enough. He'd assumed that the same principle applied to emotions, to relationships, to the fundamental human need for connection. But watching a 7-year-old homeless girl heal a $500,000 dog simply through presence and unconditional acceptance forced him to confront a terrible truth. Some things couldn't be purchased. Some things required something more fundamental than money. He began making subtle changes to the arrangement. He instructed his kitchen staff to prepare meals that Maya particularly enjoyed. She'd mentioned a preference for her mother's homemade dumplings, and he somehow managed to locate a restaurant that made them well. He arranged for her mother to receive medical attention for the persistent cough. He ensured that the hotel room was always perfectly comfortable, with extra blankets and a small television for entertainment. To any outside observer, these were simply the actions of a wealthy man ensuring his guests were comfortable, but was beginning to recognize them as something else. The first faltering steps toward genuine human care, which was entirely unfamiliar territory for him. On the 7th day of their arrangement, something unexpected happened. Titan had been sleeping, resting his head on Maya's lap while she sat reading a children's book that one of the hotel staff had provided. The dog suddenly jerked awake, his body tensing, his eyes opening wide. For a moment, thought Titan's aggression was returning, that the behavioral improvement was about to collapse. Instead, Titan began to cry. It was a sound unlike anything had ever heard from a dog, deep, mournful, filled with a grief so profound that it transcended species barriers. The dog's massive frame shook with the force of his emotion. Tears, actual tears, rolled down his muzzle. He pressed his body against Maya's with desperate force, as if trying to merge with her, to make certain she could never be separated from him again. Maya didn't panic or pull away. She held the dog, rocking him gently, whispering reassurances that seemed to gradually calm his emotional storm. Within minutes, Titan had exhausted the intensity of his grief and drifted back to sleep, his body pressing against Maya's with a possessiveness that made his feelings unmistakably clear. Stood in his doorway, watching this scene, and felt something fundamental shift within him. He realized that Titan hadn't been an aggressive, defective dog. He'd been a traumatized, lonely creature searching desperately for the one thing that all his expensive pedigree and perfect breeding had failed to provide: genuine love and acceptance. And it wasn't the trainers or the money or the expertise that had provided it. It was a homeless 7-year-old girl who had less material wealth than his monthly expenditure on office supplies, but possessed riches that money absolutely could not purchase. For the first time in his adult life, felt genuinely poor. December 29th arrived with crystalline clarity and brutal cold. The deadline was now undeniably imminent. Just one day remained before the 30-day challenge concluded. The media frenzy had intensified to almost unbearable levels. News vans lined the streets outside the building. Reporters camped in the lobby, desperate for any update about the impossible dog and the impossible bet. Social media was ablaze with speculation. Betting pools had accumulated millions of dollars wagered on various outcomes. Late-night comedians had made jokes about the challenge for weeks, and it had become a cultural touchstone, a story that transcended the usual boundaries of news and entertainment to become something genuinely mythological. Had made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He'd invited Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a renowned veterinary behaviorist with international credentials and a reputation for rigorous, unbiased assessment, to conduct an independent evaluation of Titan's current behavioral state. Dr. Morgan had published extensively on canine psychology. She'd worked with military and police departments worldwide. She'd consulted on some of the most challenging behavioral cases in modern history. She was, by virtually every measure, the gold standard in her field. She was also someone couldn't manipulate or deceive. Dr. Morgan arrived at the penthouse on the afternoon of December 29th, exactly one day before the deadline expired. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp, observant eyes and a manner that conveyed both warmth and absolute professional competence. She carried with her specialized equipment, behavioral assessment forms, and a skepticism that came from years of encountering exaggerated claims and desperate hope masquerading as reality. "Show me the dog," she said simply, removing her coat and settling into her work with practiced efficiency. For the next 6 hours, Dr. Morgan conducted a comprehensive evaluation. She observed Titan in various environments. She tested his responses to stimuli. She analyzed his body language, his vocal patterns, his reactions to commands and emotional cues. She documented everything with scientific precision, refusing to be influenced by the obvious media circus surrounding the situation. Maya remained present throughout most of the evaluation, though had arranged for her to be occupied in another section of the penthouse for portions of the assessment, ensuring that Dr. Morgan's observations weren't skewed by the girl's presence. What emerged from Dr. Morgan's evaluation was undeniable. Titan had been fundamentally transformed. The dog showed zero signs of previous aggression. His stress responses were normal and measured. His behavior indicated emotional stability. His responses to commands were appropriate and willing. His overall demeanor suggested a creature that had moved from a state of trauma and dysregulation into something approaching psychological wellness. "This is remarkable," Dr. Morgan said, reviewing her notes with an expression that suggested both wonder and confusion. "I've reviewed your files about this dog, the reported aggression, the multiple trainer failures, the behavioral incidents. What I'm observing now bears almost no resemblance to that documented history. Something has fundamentally shifted in this animal's psychological state." "What caused it?" asked, though he already knew the answer. He wanted to hear Dr. Morgan articulate it. "That's what's most fascinating," Dr. Morgan replied, studying her assessment sheets. "The conventional wisdom in my field would suggest that behavioral modification requires specific training methodologies, consistent protocols, often medication in cases of severe aggression. Yet your documentation indicates that professional trainers failed repeatedly using standard approaches." She looked up from her papers, her eyes narrowing with intellectual curiosity. "What methodology did you actually employ?" Hesitated. This was the moment where he could lie, could claim credit for some revolutionary training technique, could use his wealth and influence to construct a narrative that served his interests. It would be easy. It would be entirely consistent with how he'd managed his public image for decades. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "There's a girl," he said simply, 7 years old, homeless. She arrived here about 2 weeks ago and has spent time with the dog daily. She didn't train him, she simply existed with him, provided companionship, showed him understanding without judgment." Dr. Morgan blinked, processing this information. "The girl I saw playing with the dog in the other section of the penthouse." "Yes. I'd like to observe her interaction with the dog," Dr. Morgan said with sudden intensity. "If behavioral transformation is truly occurring through non-conventional means, this is scientifically significant. This challenges fundamental assumptions about how psychological healing works in animals." Arranged for Maya to meet with Dr. Morgan and Titan in the main living area. What unfolded was a display of genuine connection that transcended professional observation. Maya entered the space, and Titan immediately gravitated toward her with unmistakable attachment. She settled onto the floor, and the dog positioned himself against her body with the comfort of long familiarity. She began speaking to him about her day, about her mother's improving health, about her hope that they might eventually find permanent housing. Dr. Morgan observed with the intensity of a scientist witnessing something that contradicted her understanding of how the world worked. For 15 minutes, she watched in silence. Then she began to cry, actual tears rolling down the face of a professional who had prided herself on objective distance and scientific neutrality. "Do you understand what I'm witnessing?" Dr. Morgan asked quietly. Unconditional love, suggested. More than that, Dr. Morgan said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm witnessing the fundamental mechanism of emotional healing. This child, without any training, without any methodology, without any theory, has provided something that all the professional expertise in my field failed to provide: genuine acceptance and presence. She turned to face directly. This dog wasn't defective. He was traumatized. Trauma creates aggression as a survival mechanism. The aggression isn't a character flaw. It's a symptom of psychological damage. What your dog needed wasn't dominance training or behavioral modification techniques. He needed someone to recognize his pain and meet him in that pain without judgment or agenda. Dr. Morgan paused, her eyes moving between Titan, Maya, and your challenge asked whether anyone could calm this dog. The answer is yes. He's been calmed, but not through training, through genuine human connection. She prepared her official report that evening. The documentation was comprehensive, scientifically rigorous, and absolutely clear. Titan had been transformed from an aggressive animal into a psychologically stable, emotionally responsive dog. The transformation was genuine, permanent, and attributable to intensive positive emotional engagement with a specific individual over a sustained period. In technical terms, had won his bet. But standing in his penthouse that evening, looking at the report that confirmed his victory, felt something entirely unexpected. He didn't care about winning. He didn't care about the $1 million he would receive or the vindication of his impossible challenge. What he cared about was looking out his window at the city below and recognizing something he'd been missing his entire adult life. He cared about a little girl who'd walked across a frozen city to check on a dog because she was worried about his emotional. He cared about a traumatized animal who'd found healing through connection rather than control. He cared about the possibility that his expensive, isolated, achievement-focused life might be capable of transformation as profound as Titan's. As midnight approached and the final hours before his deadline ticked away, made a decision that would alter everything about his future. The moment of decision arrived at 11:47 p.m. on December 29th, exactly 13 minutes before midnight and the deadline's official expiration. Stood in his penthouse office, holding Dr. Morgan's official report, which confirmed without question that the impossible had been accomplished. Titan had been calmed. The bet was technically won. According to the strict terms he'd established, he was entitled to refuse payment because he'd never actually expected to lose. He could easily claim victory without paying anything. His lawyers had already prepared the documentation. They'd reviewed every clause of the challenge, identified technical loopholes, and constructed arguments that would almost certainly hold up in court if anyone tried to challenge his refusal to pay. Had built his empire on exactly this kind of calculated thinking, identifying advantages, exploiting them, maximizing benefit while minimizing obligation. But something had shifted fundamentally within him over the past 2 weeks. He thought about Maya's mother, who had worked multiple jobs since arriving in this country, who had sacrificed everything for her daughter, who had lost everything to medical debt through no fault of her own. He thought about Maya herself, a 7-year-old girl who understood connection and compassion in ways that most adults never achieved. He thought about Titan, a creature who had been broken by the world and healed by love. And he thought about himself. Was extraordinarily wealthy. He was powerful. He was respected in his industry. He was featured in magazines and interviews. He had built something genuinely impressive by conventional measures. Yet he'd spent decades isolated from authentic human connection, believing that distance maintained power, that emotional reserve prevented vulnerability, that treating relationships as transactions was simply pragmatic business thinking. What if he'd been wrong about all of it? At 11:52 p.m., made phone calls to his lawyers, instructing them to immediately prepare documentation transferring $1 million to and Maya. The lawyers were confused. They'd been preparing arguments against payment just hours earlier. but was absolute in his instruction. Then he made another call. He contacted the director of homeless services in Manhattan, asking about the most pressing needs in the shelter system. He learned about funding shortfalls, inadequate resources, families being turned away because capacity was exceeded. He learned about children living on streets, about preventable illnesses that became critical because there was no access to health care, about the cascade of consequences that poverty created. By 12:30 a.m. on December 30th, had established the Family Foundation with an initial funding commitment of $50 million. The foundation's purpose was clear and direct: prevent homelessness, provide family stability resources, offer mental health services to trauma survivors, and create pathways toward economic self-sufficiency for displaced populations. He wasn't trying to win any awards for charity. He wasn't seeking public credit or media coverage. He was simply acknowledging, finally and fully, that his wealth had been accumulated within a system that created poverty, and that his accumulated advantages imposed on him an obligation to address that system's failures. Over the following weeks, as the story leaked to the press and the media seized upon the narrative, underwent a transformation that shocked those who'd known him professionally for decades. He became publicly visible in ways he never had been before, not to promote himself, but to advocate for homeless populations and systemic change. He met with city officials, proposed policy changes, and committed to ongoing funding that would actually address root causes rather than simply providing temporary relief. His life changed overnight and then gradually, over months and years, transformed into something genuinely sustainable. The foundation secured permanent housing for both her and Maya, received job training, and was eventually hired in an administrative position at the foundation itself, where she worked to understand and address the very systems that had once displaced her family. The medical debt that had destroyed her family was paid off completely. She received ongoing health care, therapy for the trauma of homelessness, and the stability that allowed her to focus on being present for her daughter rather than simply surviving day to day. Maya thrived in ways that seemed almost improbable given her circumstances just months earlier. She attended an excellent school, no longer worrying about where she'd sleep or whether she'd have food. But more importantly, she maintained her connection with her mother while beginning to develop the psychological tools to process the trauma she'd experienced. She understood, in a way that most children didn't, that connection was the pathway to healing, for humans and for dogs alike. Titan became something entirely unexpected, a certified therapy dog working within the Foundation's programs. He and Maya worked together in homeless shelters, trauma centers, and counseling facilities. Children who'd experienced displacement and loss responded to Titan's presence in ways that conventional therapy sometimes couldn't achieve. The massive German Shepherd who'd been labeled dangerous, defective, and impossible became instead a healer, not through training, but through his own history of trauma and recovery. The story of Titan and Maya began appearing in academic journals exploring the mechanisms of emotional healing. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan published extensively about the case, challenging conventional wisdom in her field and advocating for approaches to trauma recovery that emphasized connection over control. Universities began inviting her to speak about how a homeless child and a dangerous dog had transformed everything experts thought they understood about behavioral psychology. This transformation became almost as famous as the story that catalyzed it. Business magazines ran profiles titled "The Billionaire Who Found Meaning," and When Money Became Secondary. His tech empire continued operating profitably under competent management, but his focus had shifted entirely. He spent his time on the foundation, on policy work, on listening to homeless populations about what they actually needed rather than what wealthy people assumed they needed. 5 years later, on December 30th, the anniversary of his life-changing decision, stood at a formal event celebrating the Foundation's milestones. 2,000 individuals had been moved from homelessness into permanent housing. 400 children had received educational scholarships. A comprehensive mental health program had been developed. Policy changes had been implemented at city level. But the most powerful moment came when he watched Maya, now 12 years old, give a speech about her experience. She talked about the alley, about finding Titan, about the billionaire who'd chosen compassion over victory. She talked about her mother's recovery and resilience. She talked about her plan to study psychology, determined to dedicate her life to helping other traumatized people the way she'd been helped. "Connection saved me," Maya told the assembled crowd. "Not money, not expertise, not all the things that people with advantages are supposed to believe matter most. Connection saved me, and connection saved the dog that everyone said was impossible. I think maybe connection is the thing we're all actually looking for, whether we understand it or not." Felt tears on his face, a phenomenon that still surprised him even after years of emotional reconnection. He'd spent 5 decades building walls, accumulating wealth, maintaining distance. He'd been so afraid that vulnerability would cost him everything. What he discovered instead was that authentic connection was the only thing that actually had value. Everything else was just stuff, impressive, expensive stuff, but ultimately empty without human meaning attached to it. Titan, now 11 years old, rested against Maya's leg as she spoke. The dog's life trajectory had been remarkable, from aggressive, uncontrollable animal to therapy dog to living symbol of the transformative power of compassion. As reflected on everything that had changed, he recognized that the real transformation hadn't been Titan's or Maya's or Evan's. The real transformation had been his own. The billionaire who'd made a bet he thought was unwinnable had instead discovered that the only thing worth winning was the capacity to genuinely love and connect with other human beings. He'd lost his impossible bet. But in losing, he'd found everything that actually mattered.